Gamo Tak was walking out of the Golden Lotus when something small blocked his path. Not a rival, not a weapon. A little girl in a yellow dress, rain-soaked and trembling, holding out a worn teddy bear with one missing eye. She wasn't offering it as a gift. She was paying him with it. His men moved fast, too fast. But he raised one hand and they froze. He crouched down, his 6-foot frame folding until he was level with her face, and when he looked into her dark, tear-filled eyes, he felt something crack open in his chest that 30 years of violence had never managed to touch. "What's his name?" he asked, nodding at the bear. Her voice barely made it out. "Barnaby. He keeps me safe at night." She pushed the bear closer. "But my mommy needs him more than I do right now." He took it. The wet fur pressed cold and heavy into his palm, a child's whole world reduced to something that fit inside one scarred hand. He held it carefully, the way you hold something you know you have no right to touch. Then he leaned in, his voice dropping to that low, dangerous register that made grown men go quiet in crowded rooms. "Who took her, little one?" She swallowed. Her dark eyes held his without flinching, and something in that, the sheer nerve of it, made his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. And then she said 7 words that made 30 armed men reach for their guns at the same time. "Stay with me until the end," because what this child said next exposed a betrayal that shook the most powerful syndicate on the East Coast to its foundation. If this story moves you, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop "the dragon" in the comments if you make it all the way to the end. Now let's begin. Gamo Tak didn't run the streets of this city through intimidation alone. He ran them through architecture, the careful, invisible architecture of fear, loyalty, and silence he had been building since he was 19 years old with nothing but a debt, a name, and the willingness to bleed for both. By the time he was 38, the Golden Dragon Syndicate wasn't just an organization, it was the city's second government. Quieter, more efficient, more final. He stood 6 feet tall with the kind of stillness that made rooms shrink when he entered them. His black hair was swept back from a face that had been called many things, handsome by the women who watched him from a careful distance, dangerous by the men who had tested him and survived to tell it, and unreadable by everyone else. A dragon coiled up the left side of his neck, the ink so detailed it seemed to breathe when his jaw tightened. His shirts were always white. It was a choice that said something about him that he wasn't afraid of what might stain them. That Tuesday evening, the rain had been falling since 4 o'clock, and by 7 it had turned the downtown streets into black mirrors. The Golden Lotus glowed amber in the wet dark, the smell of sesame oil and expensive whiskey drifting through its heavy wooden doors. Gamo Tak stepped out into the rain without an umbrella. He never used one. His men, Kenji, at his left shoulder, 2 others flanking the rear, matched his pace instinctively, the way shadows follow a moving light. No one on that block made eye contact. A woman pulling a cart of groceries found a sudden reason to cross the street. A delivery driver parked at the curb decided he could come back later. The city knew how to behave when the dragon walked, but the little girl didn't know the rules. Or maybe she did, and had decided they didn't apply to her tonight. She was standing near the rear door of the black SUV small, maybe 6 years old, her dark skin catching the amber glow of the streetlights like something carved from warm earth. Her hair was pulled into 2 uneven twists, and her yellow dress, thin cotton soaked through with rain, clung to her small frame. Her sneakers had been white once, now gray with the city. She held the teddy bear at chest level with both hands, pressing it toward him like an offering placed on an altar. One of the bear's eyes was missing. The fur along its left ear had been rubbed smooth from years of being held exactly the way she was holding it now with everything. Kenji stepped forward. Gamo Tak stopped him with 2 fingers. He looked down at the girl for a long moment, reading her the way he read every situation, searching for the angle, the motive, the hidden thing beneath the visible thing. What he found was something that didn't belong in his world. There was no angle. There was only a child who was terrified, and still standing her ground. "Her name is Barnaby," the girl said before he could speak. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it was steady. "She only has one eye, but she can still see in the dark." She pushed the bear closer. "I want you to take her. She's the most important thing I have, and I want you to bring my mommy back." Gamo Tak looked at the bear. He looked at the girl. Behind him, the rain drummed a slow, patient rhythm against the roof of the SUV. "Why come to me?" he asked. His voice was low, almost gentle, a register his men had never heard before. She looked up at him, and for a second the streetlight caught the tears on her cheeks and turned them gold. Because the police said it wasn't their problem. Her bottom lip pressed tight, and Mrs. Park at the laundromat said, "You make problems disappear." He almost smiled. Mrs. Park had been paying the syndicate's protection rate for 4 years, and had apparently developed her own theology around it. He reached out slowly, because she deserved that, and his large, scarred hand closed around Barnaby's worn body. The contrast was almost violent, the bear disappearing into a hand that had made grown men confess things they'd carried in silence for a decade. He took it. The wet fur pressed cold and heavy into his palm, a child's whole world reduced to something that fit inside one scarred hand. He held it carefully. The way you hold something you know you have no right to touch. Then he leaned in, his voice dropping to that low, dangerous register that made grown men go quiet in crowded rooms. Who took her, little one? She swallowed. Her dark eyes held his without flinching, and something in that, the sheer nerve of it, made his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Tell me her name, he said. Your mother, Regina, the girl said. Regina Daniels. He knew that name. He had known it for 2 years. From a distance he had kept deliberately, for reasons he hadn't fully examined, reasons that lived in a part of himself he didn't often visit. Regina Daniels ran the East Side Youth Center on Morrow Street. He had passed that block more times than his schedule required, always finding some operational justification that dissolved under honest scrutiny. What he knew of her, he had assembled in fragments. A woman who had built something real in a neighborhood that kept being told it didn't deserve anything, whose presence in a room arrived before she did not loudly. Not through performance, but through the particular gravity of someone who meant every step they took. He tucked Barnaby into the inside pocket of his jacket. What's your name? He asked the girl. Zola. He said it once, like he was filing it somewhere permanent. Stay here. Don't move. He looked at Kenji. Get the car. We aren't going to the docks. And then Zola said it, the 7 words that changed everything. The men who took her, they wore your dragon. The silence that followed was a living thing. Gamotak went very still. Then, behind him, he heard it 30 safety catches releasing in sequence, like a row of dominoes falling in a quiet room. His men weren't reaching for their guns to threaten the child. They were reaching because she had just told them there was a wolf inside the House of the Dragon, and every one of them was wondering if the man standing next to him was the wolf. Gamotak did not turn around. He kept his eyes on Zola's face, on the raw, unguarded honesty in her expression, and understood, with the cold clarity of a man who had survived this long by reading rooms perfectly, that she was telling the truth. This wasn't a kidnapping. This was a message, and someone had written it in his name. The city didn't stop for revelations. Somewhere down the block, a car horn blared. A neon sign buzzed above a closed convenience store. Rain kept falling, indifferent and steady, like it had seen too much to bother being dramatic about any of it. But in the circle of amber light outside the Golden Lotus, everything had stopped. Gamotak straightened slowly. He didn't spin around. He didn't raise his voice. Men who had survived as long as he had learned early that the most dangerous response to a shock was a visible one. Instead, he turned with the measured calm of someone who had already decided what came next, even though, for the first time in years, he hadn't. His eyes moved across his men one by one. Kenji, whose hand rested on the grip of his weapon but whose face was stone. Day, the youngest enforcer, whose jaw had gone tight. Park, the oldest, who had already stepped back half a pace, not from fear but from the instinct of a man triangulating threats. Every one of them had a weapon drawn or hovering. Every one of them was looking at the others. That was the thing about betrayal. It didn't announce itself. It just made everyone a suspect at the same time. Put them away, Motak said quietly. Nobody moved immediately. That itself was information. I said put them away. Underneath the quiet this time was something tectonic, a pressure that didn't need volume to communicate consequence. One by one, the weapons disappeared. He looked back at Zola. She hadn't moved. She stood in her soaked yellow dress with her small chin lifted, watching him with eyes that held no apology for what she'd said. She hadn't known what those words would detonate. Or maybe, in the way children sometimes understand things that adults have trained themselves not to see, she had known exactly. The men who took your mother, Motak said, crouching again, his voice dropping to something that existed only between the two of them. How many were there? Zola held up 4 fingers. Then she thought about it and added a 5th. Did they come to your home? She shook her head. The community center. Mommy was locking up. I was waiting outside on the steps. Her voice caught. She pressed through it. They told me to go home. The tall one looked at me and said, "Tell anyone, and she doesn't come back." A pause. I didn't tell anyone. I came to you instead. The distinction she drew between telling someone and coming to him was not lost on Motak. In her 6-year-old logic, he wasn't just anyone. He was something outside the category of people the threat applied to. He almost envied her that certainty. He stood and turned to Kenji. The dragon tattoos. Who outside this organization has access to that design? Something moved behind Kenji's eyes, dread arriving at a conclusion it had been avoiding. There was a print order. 6 months ago. 50 transfers. Custom ink. I signed off on it personally for the new initiates. He stopped. The count came back at 43. I assumed it was a print error. You assumed, Motak repeated. The word landed like a stone dropped from a height. 7 tattoo transfers unaccounted for. 5 men at the community center. The math didn't require genius, it required someone willing to look at it directly, which Kenji clearly hadn't been. Motak said nothing further about it. Not here. But his silence carried its own complete sentence. Someone inside this house gave our brand to outsiders, Motak said. That means someone wanted this city to believe the Golden Dragon takes women from community centers. He paused. They wanted me to look like a monster. Nobody spoke. He felt the weight of Barnaby against his chest, not through his hand, just present. A small pressure against his ribs that he was becoming quietly aware of in a way he couldn't entirely account for. It was no longer about territory or brand protection. Something else had entered the equation. Something he didn't have a clean word for yet. Kenji. Boss. Find out which of our brothers decided to franchise our name without permission. And find out everything there is to know about a man called Soren. He looked toward the end of the street, in the direction of the waterfront, where the city's darkest business happened under cover of tide and fog. We aren't going to the docks tonight, but we're going to need to know every inch of them before morning. Zola tugged the edge of his jacket. He looked down. You'll find her? She asked. Motak looked at this child, 6 years old, soaked through, standing in the middle of the most dangerous block in the city, with her chin up, and her heart completely open, and felt something shift in his chest with the slow, irrevocable weight of a door closing on everything that came before it. I already started, he said. The penthouse sat 42 floors above the city, and from up here the rain looked almost peaceful, thin silver threads dissolving against the dark geometry of streets below. Motak stood at the floor-to-ceiling window with a glass of bourbon he hadn't touched, watching the city the way a chess player watches a board mid-game. Not with emotion, with architecture. The mahogany desk behind him held one thing that didn't belong there. Barnaby sat under the desk lamp, with its remaining eye catching the low light, the worn fur casting a small, soft shadow across $10,000 worth of polished wood. It had no business being in this room. This room had hosted men whose decisions moved markets and ended careers, and yet the bear was the only thing in it tonight that felt like it carried any real weight. Motak turned from the window and sat across from it. He had known Regina Daniels by reputation before he knew her by sight. The East Side Youth Center on Morrow Street existed in the syndicate's operational awareness, the way landmarks did as a fixed point in the geography of the neighborhood, neutral ground, one of the addresses his men were instructed not to touch. He had added it to that list himself, 2 years ago, without explaining his reasoning to anyone, including himself. The first time he saw her in person was at a neighborhood council meeting. He attended through a proxy, a routine surveillance exercise that became something else the moment she stood to address the room. She wore a deep burgundy dress and spoke without notes, her voice carrying the kind of unhurried authority that doesn't come from rehearsal. It comes from believing completely in what you're saying. She laid out a funding argument with the precision of someone who had done the math 17 times, and wasn't asking for sympathy, just accountability. The council members shifted in their seats. Motak, watching through a partition, found himself leaning forward without realizing he had moved. He filed the observation under irrelevant and returned to his car. The second time was 3 weeks later. She was locking up the center at dusk and dropped her keys on the front steps. The small, ordinary fumble of it, the slight exhale of frustration, the way she gathered herself and continued, without making anything of it, lodged in him somewhere specific. He was half a block away. She didn't see him. He told himself he happened to be passing. He had been telling himself that for 2 years. Now Kenji stood across the desk from him with a folder, and the expression of a man who understood that this briefing was different from every other briefing that had preceded it. She's been running the center for 4 years, Kenji said. Clean record. No political affiliations, no debts. Applied twice for city arts funding, denied both times. Operates entirely on private donations. He paused. She has a daughter, 6 years old. I know, Motak said. Kenji looked at him, said nothing. Soren, Motak said. Former military, Eastern European network, operating in the port district for 8 months. Everything he does is designed to generate a paper trail that ends at our door. He's not building territory. Kenji's voice was careful. He's building a case. The kidnapping is the centerpiece, but only if it holds long enough for the right people to notice. Motak stood. He buttoned his jacket with the slow, final precision of a decision already made. Cancel the Inchin meeting. Pull Day and the second unit from the docks. I want everyone with any connection to the print order in a room within the hour. He looked at the bear one more time at its single eye, its worn patience, the way it sat on his expensive desk like it belonged there. And Kenji. Boss, nobody rests until she is home. The chair was metal. That was the first thing Regina registered. Not the dark, not the voices through the wall, not the rope binding her wrists behind her back. The chair. Cold steel conducting the chill of the room directly into her spine with the thorough efficiency of something purpose-built for discomfort. She had been here wherever here was for what felt like a full day. The environment gave her information her eyes couldn't. Brine and engine oil layering the air with the heaviness of a space that had spent decades absorbing both. Somewhere beyond the walls, water moved in long, slow rhythms against something structural. A waterfront warehouse. She had grown up 2 miles from the port and knew that particular combination the way you know a recurring dream without having to identify its parts. She was not blindfolded. That had concerned her more than the ropes at first, until she reframed it. They weren't worried about her identifying the location because they expected to control what she did with the information. That was useful. It meant they still needed something from her, which meant she still had leverage, even tied to a chair in the dark. Regina Daniels was 34 years old and had spent the last 4 years building something from nothing in a neighborhood that had been officially written off. She had learned during that process that fear was a resource you could spend it in panic, or compress it into clarity. She was compressing it now. The discipline of it left her jaw tight, and her breathing measured. Each exhale through the nose, each inhale counted. Zola's face arrived without invitation every few minutes, the way her daughter always arrived without ceremony, occupying whatever space was available. 7 years old and watchful, always watchful, storing things up behind her large, dark eyes like she was building an archive. Regina had told her 3 things above everything else in her life. Stay close to people who love you, trust what your body tells you, and never let anyone make you feel small for taking up space. She pressed those 3 instructions together now like a talisman and held them. She didn't let herself go further than Zola's face. Further was a door she couldn't open and stay functional. The lock turned. He entered without urgency, tall, pale in the gray light, close-cropped hair, moving with the particular stillness of a man whose body had been a professional instrument for a long time. He placed a chair in front of her, reversed it, sat with his forearms resting on the back. His eyes were a flat, colorless gray that didn't warm or cool regardless of what he was looking at. Not cruelty exactly. Cruelty had temperature. This was something more clinical, the expression of a man who had long ago separated his actions from their human consequences. Your composure is impressive, he said. His accent was faint, Eastern European. Most people have cried by now. Regina said nothing. The ledger, he said. The documentation you've been building for the oversight committee. Names, accounts, transfer records. He tilted his head fractionally. I need to know who else has seen it. She kept her face neutral. The ledger was real. She had spent 18 months building it, after discovering that a city councilman had routed an unauthorized payment through the center's nonprofit status. What began as self-protection had grown, with the patient accumulation of someone who understood that power abhors a vacuum, into something that connected city contracts to port operations, to men whose names appeared in no public record. She had told no one. Not her attorney, not her board, not the woman who had been her closest friend for 11 years. The documentation lived in a fireproof lockbox beneath the floorboard of her office, and she had been waiting for the right moment, the right contact, the right guarantee that delivering it wouldn't simply result in its burial. Apparently waiting had its own risks. I don't know what you're referring to, she said. Soren, she didn't know his name yet, but she had already assigned him one in her mind. Something cold and functional almost smiled. The expression involved his mouth only. You're going to make this take longer than it needs to. I run an underfunded youth center, she said. I'm very accustomed to things taking longer than they need to. Something shifted in his assessment of her, not respect, but the recalibration of a man who had underestimated a variable. He stood, replaced the chair against the wall with deliberate care, and moved toward the door. Think about what you're protecting, he said without turning. Then decide if it's worth the chair. The lock turned again. Regina exhaled through her nose, kept her spine straight, thought about the ledger and what it represented, not just her own protection, but accountability for a system that had spent years feeding on neighborhoods like hers while calling it civic management. Then she thought about Zola. Then she made a decision, quiet and complete, in the cold and the dark. She was not going to give him a single syllable. Whatever was coming, she would be thinking clearly when it arrived. She had not built 4 years of something real, from nothing to surrender it to a man with colorless eyes and a reversed chair. She tightened her hands behind her back, not from fear. From the particular resolve of a woman who knew exactly what she was protecting and had already decided it was worth every minute in this chair. By midnight, the rain had thinned to a fine, cold mist that turned every streetlight into a smear of color against the dark. Gamotak moved through it without announcing himself. No convoy tonight, no flanking formation, just the black SUV rolling to a stop 2 blocks from the target. Engine cut, 4 doors opening in near silence. He had changed from the white shirt before leaving the penthouse. White was a statement, and tonight he had no statements to make. He wore black, no jacket, and moved through the mist-slicked streets with the fluid precision of a man operating at the intersection of instinct and preparation. Nothing wasted, nothing performed, every step, exactly where it needed to be, and no further. Kenji matched his pace. Day and 2 others spread behind them at intervals that looked casual and weren't. The Harlow building, Kenji murmured, condemned for 3 years. 2 of the men from the print order were placed there 6 days ago by our contact at the fish market. The building materialized through the mist, 4 stories of corrugated rust and broken windows. A single light burning on the 2nd floor like something that had forgotten to go out. Motak read it from half a block away. 1 entry point well lit and therefore watched. 2 likely blind spots on the eastern face. A fire escape on the north side that hadn't been maintained long enough to trust weight, but would hold someone light and careful. 2 inside, possibly 3, Kenji said. No heavy equipment. Motak looked at the 2nd floor light for another 3 seconds. Then he moved. The entry took less time than most people take to pour a drink. The 2 men inside were midway through a card game, a portable heater glowing orange between them, takeout containers pushed to the table's edge with the comfortable disorganization of people who expected to be there a while. The expressions that moved across their faces when Motak appeared in the doorway: confusion first, then recognition, then the specific terror of understanding that recognition was the worst possible outcome, told him everything he needed to know about their position in Soren's operation. These were not architects. They were furniture. He sat across from them at their own table with the ease of a man who considered every room he entered his own. "I'm not going to make this dramatic," he said. "You're going to tell me where Soren is keeping the woman from Morrow Street. You're going to tell me how many men are with her, and you're going to tell me which of my people provided the tattoo transfers." He placed both hands flat on the table. "After that, you'll leave this city tonight and never conduct business within 300 miles of any territory I hold." A pause. "That is the generous arrangement." The younger one broke in under 6 minutes. The older one lasted 9. Neither was built for this. They had borrowed a monster's reputation and found themselves sitting across from the original. The location: Caldwell Shipyard, East Dock, 3rd structure from the water. The number of guards: 7 on rotation. The name of Motak's man who had sold the transfers. Someone who had held perimeter security for 3 years. Someone who had eaten at his table on the occasion of 2 New Year celebrations. The name arrived in Motak's chest with the dull, specific weight of something that had already happened, not shocking, because nothing truly shocked a man who understood that loyalty was a choice. People renewed daily, and sometimes stopped renewing. But heavy in the way that particular kind of loss is always heavy, regardless of how many times you've absorbed it before. He stood, adjusted his sleeves. "Kenji," I heard. Flat, contained, the voice of a man putting something away to deal with privately. Outside, the mist had thickened back into proper rain. Motak stood on the wet pavement and looked toward the waterfront, too far to see, but present in the air. That particular cold that comes off open water at night and carries everything the tide has touched. He thought about a little girl on a stool near a front door, watching through a narrow window, waiting for a promise to come back. "How long to mobilize the full unit?" he asked. 40 minutes, Kenji said. 25, Motak said, and walked back to the SUV. The Caldwell Shipyard at 2 in the morning existed at the edge of the city's awareness, far enough from downtown that its sounds didn't carry, close enough to the water that the tide set the rhythm of everything. Massive crane structures rose against the overcast sky. Shipping containers formed corridors that absorbed sound and light with equal efficiency. The air tasted of iron and brine, and the specific cold of a place that did its work at night and asked no questions. Motak stood at the shipyard's western perimeter and looked at the 3rd structure from the water. Long and low corrugated steel gone dark with weather, high windows covered in plastic sheeting that bellied in and out with the wind's slow breath. 2 guards at the main entrance, relaxed in the particular way of men who have been standing in the dark for too long without incident. 2 more on the eastern flank on a rotation. A 5th on the roof, stationary. A 6th at the rear access door. 7. As reported. The number held. He turned to the 12 men assembled behind him in the dark, distributed, still, professionally quiet. East and rear simultaneously, he said. Main entrance is mine and Kenji. Nobody discharges unless fired upon first. I need the interior clean. He found Day's eyes in the dark. You locate the woman, you hold position. She doesn't move until I clear the space and come to her personally. He held Day's gaze, until the younger man nodded with the weight of someone who understood the instruction was not a suggestion. Clock starts when I move. He moved. The 2 men at the main entrance had 4 seconds between registering the figure walking toward them through the dark and understanding what that figure represented. 4 seconds was not enough time to make a good decision, and they didn't. Motak came through the entrance without breaking stride and into the building's interior in the same continuous motion, not aggressive, not theatrical, simply present on the other side of the obstacle before the obstacle had fully processed that it was won. Inside, cavernous, the ceiling swallowed by darkness. 4 work lights strung down the center of the space, casting everything in a flat, industrial yellow, crates along the walls. A folding table with equipment. 3 men turning from various positions, all registering the breach simultaneously, all reaching. What followed took 90 seconds. Motak moved through it the way a current moves through a space, finding every point of resistance and resolving it with the minimum force required. Nothing decorative, nothing excessive. Each action complete before the next began. By the time the last man was down, Kenji was breathing harder than usual, which told Motak that at least one moment had been closer than the plan intended. He noted this without comment and moved toward the back of the building, the door with the light beneath it. He stopped outside it, pressed one hand flat against the steel, not pushing, just present, listening. Behind the door, silence first, then the sound of a chair shifting on concrete, still upright, still conscious. Something in him that had been held tight since the moment Zola said Regina's name, released by precisely 1 degree. He opened the door. Regina Daniels looked up at him from the metal chair, not with the fractured expression of someone who had been waiting to be rescued, but with the stripped-down focus of a woman who had spent the last 36 hours deciding exactly how she intended to meet whatever came through that door. The single work light above her caught the damage on her face. A bruise along her left cheekbone, a cut at the corner of her lip that had dried dark. Motak registered each detail with a cold, thorough attention he would process later, in private, in whatever way he processed the things that got past his defenses. She recognized him. He watched it move through her expression confusion first, then the rapid, unsentimental recalibration of a woman reordering a situation in real time. She didn't look relieved. She looked like someone updating a calculation. He crossed the room, produced the silver pocket knife from his jacket, moved behind her without asking permission, because asking would have cost them both time, and she didn't need ceremony. She needed out and cut through the rope in 2 clean strokes. She brought her arms forward slowly, flexing her fingers against the pain of circulation returning, and he watched her hands, the careful, deliberate movement of them, the small, controlled wince she didn't quite suppress, and said nothing. Then she turned and looked at him over her shoulder. This close, in the thin light of the warehouse, he could see things about her face that distance had never permitted before. The precise quality of her composure, not a mask, not performance, but something structural, built from the inside out over years of choosing not to be diminished. There was no gratitude on her face yet, no softness, just that direct, unblinking attention that didn't flatter and didn't condemn and made him, for reasons he couldn't fully articulate, want to be worth it. Zola, she said. 1 word, a direction, not a question. She's safe, he said, and waiting. Regina Daniels stood up from that chair like she was reclaiming something that had always belonged to her. He stepped back, gave her the room, and followed her out. Soren was not at the shipyard. Motak had known this before they breached the perimeter. A man who constructs operations from the outside in doesn't position himself inside them. He watches from a distance and lets other people absorb the cost of being wrong. It was a philosophy Motak understood with the intimacy of someone who had once practiced it himself. The difference between them was that Motak had always been willing to step inside when the moment demanded it. Soren, it turned out, was not. They found him through a thread so thin it should have broken a prepaid phone abandoned on the folding table inside the shipyard. A single outgoing call placed 3 hours earlier to a number registered to a short-term rental on the 11th floor of the Meridian Tower. 4 blocks from the Golden Lotus. 4 blocks from Motak's front door. The placement of it had the specific arrogance of a man who believed his opponent too proud to look close to home for a threat. Motak looked at the address in Kenji's hand and felt something clarify behind his eyes with the cold, clean quality of a decision that had already been made. Take Regina to Morrow Street, he he said. "Stay with her until I call." Regina, who had been standing beside the SUV with her arms folded in the particular way of a woman who was not accustomed to being managed, looked at him directly. The bruise on her cheekbone had deepened in color during the drive, and she hadn't done anything to minimize it, which told him something he filed alongside everything else he was learning about how she moved through the world. "You know where he is," she said. "Yes, then I want to." "Zola hasn't slept," he said quietly. "Not as leverage. As a fact she deserved to have. She's been at the center since last night. She's been watching the door." The set of Regina's expression shifted, something moving underneath the composure, private and complete. She held his gaze for one long moment with those eyes that seemed constitutionally incapable of looking at anything indirectly. Then she got into the SUV without another word. He watched it pull away. Then he turned toward the Meridian Tower and walked. Room 1107 smelled of cigarettes, and the particular tension of a man who had been waiting too long for news that wasn't coming. The door was unlocked. Soren had been expecting one of his men with an update that would never arrive. Motok opened it and stepped inside. Soren stood at the window with his back to the room, a phone pressed to his ear, looking out at the city with the proprietary gaze of a man who was counting something he hadn't yet earned. He was broader than Motok had anticipated, wide through the shoulders, physically dense in the way of someone whose body had been built for a specific professional purpose. He turned at the sound of the door and went completely still. The phone call ended without a goodbye. "Gamotak," he said, professionally composed. The voice of a man who had rehearsed this meeting and was now running the rehearsal. Motak stopped in the center of the room. "You took a woman from Morrow Street," he said. "You put my tattoo on your men. You built a case designed to bury me under simultaneous federal and council scrutiny." He let a brief silence open. "You were thorough." "I was necessary," Soren said. "You've gone soft. The dragon used to mean something in this city. Now it means protected blocks and community centers, and an organization that hesitates. I was protecting the syndicate from its own leadership. You were protecting it from me," Motak said. "From what you're becoming." Motak was quiet for a moment. He examined the accusation honestly, the way he examined everything without the comfort of reflexive denial. He thought about what Soren was describing. The hesitation. The protected blocks. The youth center on Morrow Street that he had added to the untouchable list without explaining his reasoning to anyone, including himself. Then he thought about a 6-year-old girl pressing a one-eyed bear into his hands with more courage than most soldiers he had commanded. "You're right," Motak said. Soren blinked. The rehearsal hadn't included this. "I am becoming something different," Motak continued. He crossed the room with the same quiet, total purposefulness he brought to everything. No theater, no announcement, just complete forward motion that didn't leave room for alternatives. "The question you forgot to ask is whether different means weaker." He stopped close enough that the distance between them required a decision from Soren about whether to hold his ground. "It doesn't," Motak said. "It means I now have things worth protecting. That makes me more dangerous than I have ever been. Not less." What happened next was brief and absolute. When Motak stepped back into the hallway, he straightened his sleeves with unhurried care. The city hummed 40 stories below, indifferent and ongoing. He stood still for a moment in the dim corridor and thought not about what had just happened, but about a woman getting into an SUV and choosing her daughter over her anger, and what that particular kind of restraint said about the shape of her. He took out his phone. "It's done," he told Kenji. "I'm coming to Morrow Street." Morrow Street at 4 a.m. had a quality of stillness that existed nowhere else in the city. Not the aggressive quiet of the port, or the brittle silence of downtown after last call, something softer, more considered. The street had organized itself around the rhythms of children for years, and it showed, even now, in the way the darkness sat here, gently, without threat. The youth center sat mid-block. Even at this hour, the mural along its lower facade held its warmth, figures reaching upward. A sun painted in the upper corner with the particular imperfection of something made by human hands that somehow made it more luminous, not less. The SUV pulled up quietly. The front door opened before Motak reached the steps. Zola came through it at the velocity of a child who had been standing at that window for a long time. She was still in the yellow dress, dry now, her hair redone into 2 neat twists that the hours of waiting had only partially loosened. She stopped at the top of the steps when she saw the car, and her eyes moved past Motak with the urgent, singular focus of someone who had been holding one question in their body for 36 hours. Then Regina stepped out of the vehicle. Zola came down those steps and across the pavement and into her mother's arms with a force that had nothing to do with physics and everything to do with relief, finding the one place it had been trying to reach since the moment it was created. Regina caught her both arms coming around her daughter with a completeness that looked less like an embrace and more like a restoration. Two things that belonged together, returning to their natural configuration. The sound Zola made was not crying exactly. It was something more fundamental, the release of a sustained tension from a body too small to have been built to carry it. A sound that started somewhere deep and arrived in the air as something between a sob and an incomplete word. Regina pressed her face into her daughter's hair and said something that didn't reach the pavement. Her eyes were closed. One hand moved in slow circles on Zola's back. Motak stood at a distance that felt correct and looked at the city over their heads. He was aware of something opening in his chest, not the single degree of release he had felt outside Regina's door at the shipyard, but something wider, like a room that had been sealed receiving its first real air. The sensation was unfamiliar enough that he couldn't immediately categorize it. He stood with it instead, neither analyzing it nor dismissing it, which was itself unusual for him. After a long moment, Zola lifted her head from her mother's shoulder and looked at him over the curve of Regina's arm. Her dark eyes were wet but level. Waiting, Motak reached into his jacket pocket and produced Barnaby. He walked toward them slowly, and when he reached them, he crouched down, his large frame folding to her level the way it had outside the Golden Lotus, and she recognized the gesture because she had been the one to require it the first time and held the bear out in both hands. Zola looked at the bear, then at him. "I told you she'd keep you safe," she said, with the grave certainty of a 6-year-old who has been proven correct about something important. "She did," Motak said, "and now she belongs back where she started." He pressed Barnaby gently into Zola's hands. A king does not keep the weapons of his soldiers. Zola received the bear with both hands and held it against her chest with the immediate, instinctive relief of a child reunited with the thing that made darkness navigable. Then she looked back at him with an expression that was too old for her face and too honest for his world. "Are you going to come back?" she asked. The question bypassed every defense he had. He felt it land in a part of himself that didn't have a name yet, and sat there, patient and unmoving, waiting for an honest answer. He reached into his jacket and produced a small gold coin, the dragon emblem on one face, worn smooth from 2 decades of daily handling. He had carried it since he was 19, the first night he had understood what he was building and what it would cost him. He placed it in Zola's open hand and closed her small fingers around it. "If you ever need me," he said, "you show that to anyone on this street. They'll know what it means." Zola examined the coin with complete seriousness, then secured it in the pocket of her yellow dress with the finality of someone storing something irreplaceable. Motak stood. He looked at Regina. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't immediately name. Not gratitude alone, though that was present, and not the rapid recalibration he had seen in the warehouse. This was something quieter, the expression of a person who has been reassessing something privately and arrived somewhere they hadn't expected. It lasted only a moment before she composed it into something more measured, but he had seen it, and it settled into him like warmth entering a cold room, gradual, pervasive, impossible to ignore once it had begun. "The ledger is still under the floorboard of my office," she said. Motak held her gaze. "I know." Something sharpened in her eyes. "How long have you known about it?" "Long enough," he said, "to make sure no one reached it before tonight." The silence between them was not empty. It was the kind of silence that forms when two people are simultaneously understanding something they aren't yet ready to name. The city moved around its edges. The pre-dawn sky had begun to soften at the horizon, not light yet, but the world clearing its throat, preparing. "Thank you," Regina said, simply, without theater. Motak nodded once. He looked at Zola, who had gone quiet against her mother's shoulder, Barnaby tucked under one arm, the gold coin presumably warm in her pocket. Her eyes were closing. He turned to walk back to the SUV. "Motak." He stopped, turned. She was looking at him across the distance of the pavement. This woman who had survived 36 hours in a cold room without surrendering a single syllable, who had built 4 years of something real from nothing, who had looked at him in a dim warehouse with fresh damage on her face, and made him feel, for the first time in a long time, like being seen was not the same thing as being exposed. "The center opens at 8, she said. "I make coffee at 7:30. A pause so brief it almost wasn't there. "It's not expensive, but it's good." Something moved across Gamotak's face, unguarded, undefended, arriving before he could manage it. It lasted only a moment, but it was there. "I'll find the place," he said, and he got into the car. 3 weeks passed before Motak walked through the door of the Eastside Youth Center. Not because the days lacked fulfilling, there was the internal matter of the man who had sold the tattoo transfers, resolved quietly and completely in the way such matters were always handled. There was the restructuring of the port operations following Soren's removal. There were the ordinary frictions of maintaining an organization that existed in permanent negotiation between power and consequence. The weeks filled themselves efficiently, the way they always did. But each evening, somewhere between the last meeting and the silence that followed it, he found himself at the penthouse window, with the absence on his desk feeling strangely loud. He had not replaced Barnaby with anything. The lamp still burned over the same stretch of mahogany, and the space where the bear had sat remained empty in a way that was not neutral. He noticed this without acting on it for 22 days, which was, he would later understand, its own kind of action. He went on a Thursday morning, before the center opened, before the street had committed to being fully awake. He came alone, no Kenji, no trailing presence, no operational justification. Just himself in a dark jacket moving up Morrow Street on foot, with the particular quiet of someone who has decided something and is already past the deciding. The door was unlocked. The smell of coffee reached him before his hand touched the handle, rich and dark and unhurried. The smell of a place that had its own rhythm and wasn't adjusting it for anyone. Inside, the center held the specific warmth of a space that had been lived in with intention. Children's paintings covered the walls, houses with proportions that belonged to imagination rather than architecture. Animals assembled from pure conviction, figures with hands larger than their bodies, as though the artist understood that hands were the most important part. A reading corner with low shelves and floor cushions worn soft from use. Tables scarred with the accumulated industry of years of homework, projects, arguments, and the ordinary serious business of young people being given room to exist. Regina was behind the small counter at the back, filling a thermos with the focused efficiency of a woman who had already completed several other things this morning. She wore a deep green wrap dress, her natural hair loose around her face, and she had applied something over the bruise on her cheekbone that almost resolved it. Almost. She looked up when he entered. Neither of them performed surprise. "You found the place," she said. "You said Morrow Street," he said. "There's only one building with a sun on the wall." She poured a second cup without being asked and set it on the counter. He crossed the room and took the stool across from her, slightly too small for him, which she noticed, and which produced something brief and genuine in her expression that she made no effort to conceal. He wrapped both hands around the cup. She was right. It was good coffee. They talked for 40 minutes, and what struck him was how different it felt from every other conversation he conducted in a day, not because it was pleasant, though it was, but because nothing in it required management. She spoke about the music program she was trying to launch, the bureaucratic resistance around the funding application, the city's practiced talent for promising resources it never intended to deliver. She spoke about these things with the direct, unembellished frustration of someone who was tired of the obstacle but had no intention of stopping. He listened the way he listened, when something genuinely held his attention completely, without the performance of interest, asking questions that told her he had actually heard the previous answer. Halfway through her explanation of the endowment board's application process, he said, "I know someone on that board. He'll take my call." She looked at him with the clear-eyed, level attention of a woman who didn't process offers at face value. "I don't want anything that creates a debt I didn't agree to." "He owes me nothing," Motak said. And then, because she deserved the full truth, rather than the reassuring version, 3 years ago I helped his daughter leave a situation that was going to destroy her life. He has wanted to return that in some form ever since. I've never given him the opportunity. This would be the opportunity. He held her gaze. No leverage, no claim. Just a phone call that opens a door you've been knocking on for 2 years. She considered this with the same unhurried care she brought to everything. Then, all right, one word, simply given. It landed in him with a warmth he didn't examine directly. The door opened at 8:05, and children arrived in the immediate, total way that children arrive, dropping bags, claiming territory, filling the room with a noise that was somehow not chaotic but textured, each thread of it distinct. Zola was among them, already in her school uniform, Barnaby secured under one arm with the practiced ease of long habit. She stopped when she saw Motak on the stool and regarded him with the same grave assessment she had deployed on a wet pavement 3 weeks ago. Then she climbed onto the stool beside him without invitation and set Barnaby on the counter between them. "She wanted to see you," Zola said, with complete seriousness. Motak looked at the bear, then at the child. "How is she?" "Better," Zola said. "She sleeps better now." A pause. "So do I." The thing that moved through Motak's chest in that moment was quiet and complete, and arrived without warning, not the managed, catalogued responses he had trained himself to produce in place of genuine feeling, but something that preceded language entirely. He looked at the bear on the counter, at this child beside him who had walked into the most dangerous block in the city with her whole heart in her hands, at the woman across the counter, whose eyes held his now with an expression that was no longer recalibrating or assessing but simply, openly present, and he understood that something had already begun here, in this room, in these 3 weeks of an empty desk and a Thursday morning walk up Morrow Street. He reached into his jacket and set a folded envelope on the counter beside his coffee cup. "For the music program," he said. "No conditions attached." Regina looked at the envelope, looked at him. The morning light through the center's front windows fell across her face with the frank generosity of early sun catching the depth of her dark skin, the intelligence in her eyes, the particular quality of her attention that had been making him want to be worth it since the first time it was directed at him. "You're going to keep coming back," she said. Not quite a question, not quite a statement, something that lived in the space between the two. An observation offered with the careful openness of a woman who wasn't yet naming what she was noticing, but had decided to stop pretending she wasn't noticing it. Motak looked at the sun on the wall above the reading corner, imperfect, luminous, painted by someone who understood that warmth doesn't require perfection to be real. "I told you," he said. "I keep my word." He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Between two people who both spoke in understatement, the space around words carried as much meaning as the words themselves, and what the space around those 4 words held was enough. Outside, Morrow Street filled gradually with the sound of a normal morning engines, voices, the city resuming itself with its usual indifference to the private revolutions taking place inside its buildings. But inside the East Side Youth Center, in the warmth of good coffee and children's imperfect paintings, and a future being built one stubborn day at a time, something had taken root, not with a declaration, not with a gesture designed for an audience, just 2 people, learning, slowly and without announcement, that the distance they had each kept between themselves and the world was no longer serving either of them. The dragon had found something worth guarding that had nothing to do with territory. And on the slightly too small stool, for the first time in 38 years, Motak was exactly where he chose to be. Drop the dragon in the comments if you made it to the end. Click the video on your screen now because the city still has shadows, and not all of them are what they seem.